Welcome, my friends, to a tale of stark survival and fierce hope on the sun-blistered frontier of the American Southwest. Imagine a young woman, her heart brimming with dreams of love and security, forced into a marriage by correspondence. She travels thousands of miles, only to be left alone under the relentless desert sun, her future as parched as the scorching sand beneath her feet. Yet from that dire emptiness emerges an unlikely savior, a proud Apache chief whose compassion defies all expectations. Brace yourselves for a riveting journey where betrayal tangles with redemption, forging a destiny no one could have anticipated. Charlotte Gray first saw the endless horizon of the Arizona desert from the cramped window of a stagecoach. The heat pressed on her like a weight stifling her breath. Nevertheless, her heart raced not from discomfort, but from anticipation. She was on her way to meet Harold Beck, the man who had answered her letter in the Matrimonial News, one of those mail-order bride advertisements that promised domestic bliss to lonely settlers and adventurous women willing to brave the frontier. Charlotte was both hopeful and desperate. Her father, Thomas Gray, had passed away from a lingering fever in Pennsylvania, leaving her with nothing but a small trunk of possessions and a head full of dreams. The stagecoach rattled along a hard-packed trail. With every jolt, Charlotte clutched her mother's tattered Bible closer. It was her most treasured heirloom, the last link to a gentler world she once knew. Alongside her in the coach sat a grizzled miner who smelled of whiskey and dust, a timid widow from St. Louis, and a chatty salesman who claimed he'd once seen Wyatt Earp passing through Dodge City, though Charlotte suspected he exaggerated for effect. She listened politely, nodding at appropriate moments all the while, envisioning Harold's kindly face. In his letters, he described himself as a rancher of modest means near Fort Bowie. He wrote of a tidy homestead, a few acres of farmland, and a herd of cattle waiting to grow under the Arizona sun. He promised her a simple but decent life, far from the harsh industrial mills that had trapped her family in poverty back east. When the stagecoach finally lurched to a stop at a dusty outpost called Wilcox Station, Charlotte wiped her damp brow and squinted into the midday glare. The driver announced this was where she should wait for Harold Beck's wagon. She gathered her trunk and carefully stepped down, nerves fluttering in her stomach. An older couple and their child hopped off as well, disappearing into the squat station house. The driver tipped his hat to Charlotte, accepted her meager tip, and soon rattled off down the road, leaving her alone in the swirl of desert dust. Hours passed. Charlotte sipped warm water from a battered canteen the station master had kindly lent her. She watched the sun's merciless arc across the sky. A lizard darted beneath the porch, and the station master's horse whinnied in the pen out back. One by one, the other travelers found their rides or made alternative plans. Charlotte's was nowhere in sight. Perhaps Harold's journey was delayed, she reasoned. Maybe his wagon wheel had broken, or he'd encountered trouble with rustlers. By sunset, worry settled like a stone in her chest. The station master, a weathered man named Eli Thompson, who claimed to have once hauled freight alongside John Henry Tunstall in New Mexico, tried to reassure her. He offered her a bunk in the back of the station for the night, with the promise to help if Mr. Beck arrived at dawn. But as the stars emerged over the endless desert sky, Charlotte lay awake on a rough cot, gazing at flickering lantern shadows on the wall, wondering if this bold step westward was the worst mistake of her life. Dawn came quickly, bringing with it the piercing call of a distant hawk and the rumble of a freight wagon stopping by the station. Charlotte scrambled outside, her eyes searching hopefully. The wagon was driven by a stranger who had only come to deliver supplies. No Harold Beck, no gentle greeting, no explanation. As the morning stretched on, Eli Thompson offered to hitch his own horse and ride a few miles along the route Harold might have taken. Hours later, he returned with nothing to report but endless desert. Charlotte's heart sank. She read and reread Harold's letters, searching for clues about why he might not have arrived. The words spoke of a man eager for companionship, someone proud of his ranching prospects and anxious for a woman to share them. Yet the day dragged into late afternoon, and the horizon remained empty. The station was hardly a proper settlement, just a weathered house, a stable, and a rickety corral that Eli used for changing horses. Desperate, Charlotte borrowed a pen from Eli's wife, Ruth, and composed a letter to Harold. She asked whether something tragic had happened, or if he had simply changed his mind. She offered heartfelt apologies in case her coming had caused offense. Maybe she had misunderstood his intentions. With trembling hands, she handed the letter to a mail courier who rode in on a scrawny mule. The courier promised to deliver it if he passed near the Beck Ranch, though he'd never heard of the place himself. That evening, as Charlotte gazed at the never-ending sky, she caught sight of a flicker of movement on the horizon. A rider approached at a leisurely pace, dust swirling around his horse's hooves. Could it be Harold? Her heart pounded. But as the figure drew closer, she saw it was someone else, a lean man with a slouch hat wearing a revolver at his hip. His name was Marshall Cooper, a wandering lawman who apparently had some private business with the station. He'd known men like the Earp brothers in Tombstone, he said, back in the day. After exchanging a few words with Eli, he eyed Charlotte with a mixture of curiosity and pity. She summoned her courage to ask if he knew Harold Beck. The lawman frowned, rummaging through his memory. Harold Beck, he repeated. Can't say I do. There's a couple of ranches east of Fort Bowie, but I've never heard of anyone by that name. He offered to check the records at the nearest town, but Charlotte felt the sting of betrayal stirring. Could Harold Beck be a phantom? Had he never existed at all? A sleepless night of reflection led Charlotte to a bold decision. She could stay at Wilcox Station indefinitely, waiting for someone who might never appear, or she could travel onward. Summoning nerve she didn't know she possessed, she asked Eli for directions to Fort Bowie. If Harold truly had a ranch near there, perhaps she might find him herself. Without hesitation, and with a sympathetic look, Eli scrawled a crude map on a scrap of parchment. The route would take her across a stretch of unforgiving desert, but he believed she could find a small settlement along the way. She set out at dawn on a borrowed mule, her trunk strapped to a half-broken wagon borrowed from the station. Ruth insisted she take extra water and some provisions, dried beans, jerky, and hardtack. The desert wind gusted through Charlotte's bonnet, the sun's heat already biting. She felt a swirl of emotions, fear, anger, sorrow, and the faintest glimmer of hope that perhaps she would find Harold's ranch. Perhaps there was a simple explanation for his absence. But as the dusty miles stretched on, that hope began to wither like the sun-scorched sagebrush along the trail. The route Eli had drawn seemed straightforward on paper, but on the ground, the desert played tricks on Charlotte's senses. The unyielding sun bleached out the horizon, and rocky outcroppings looked identical for miles. Every cactus-laden ridge blurred with the next. By midday, she found herself in a labyrinth of mesas and low hills. Her clothes were already sweat-soaked, her lips parched despite rationing water. The borrowed wagon's single mule plodded wearily, occasionally braying in protest. She had no choice but to press on. When the sun reached its zenith, Charlotte searched desperately for any sign of a settlement or a landmark. Instead, she stumbled onto a fork in the trail that Eli's map hadn't mentioned. She guessed left traveling another hour until she realized it might be the wrong choice. Fear clawed at her. She couldn't go back. She had neither the energy nor the confidence to retrace her route. Each time she pulled out the map, the lines made less sense. Anxiety gave way to panic, and panic led to mistakes. Eventually, she veered off the trail entirely in search of a shortcut. The land seemed to stretch into an endless, monotonous sprawl. By late afternoon, the mule staggered from thirst and exhaustion. Charlotte, equally desperate, dismounted and tried to lead the animal to a faint glimmer that might have been a creek bed. Instead, she found nothing but bone-dry rocks. The water skins were almost empty. Her trunk had bounced loose in the wagon, scattering her small store of personal items. She had no choice but to dig through the trunk right there, searching for anything useful. She paused as her fingers brushed across her mother's Bible. Trembling, she lifted it to her chest and whispered a short prayer for guidance, for some sign to show her the way. Though not devout by upbringing, she clung to this last vestige of comfort. She promised herself she wouldn't succumb to despair. But her body was crying out for water, and her mind was starting to swirl with delirium. As the evening wind whipped the dust into swirls, the mule collapsed. Charlotte fell to her knees, tears cutting tracks through the dust on her cheeks. She wrestled with the harness, trying to coax the poor creature up, but it refused. Panicked, she realized she might die out here if she couldn't find help. The desert's hush pressed in around her, broken only by the howling wind. That night, she huddled under the wagon, which offered scant shelter. She tried to eat some jerky, but found her mouth too dry to chew. Her head pounded, her eyes burned. She couldn't sleep for fear that she might not wake. She pulled the trunk closer, feeling an irrational sense of security from the battered wood. She prayed again, not even sure to whom or what. A few hours later, the faint glow of moonlight illuminated the scrub, revealing the silhouettes of distant rocks that looked like crouching animals. She felt a wave of terror. She was alone, vulnerable, and likely too weak to fight off even a scavenging coyote. As dawn approached, Charlotte's throat burned with thirst. She felt delirious, unsure if she was dreaming or awake. In her haze, she thought she saw figures moving along the ridge, shadows gliding in the early morning light. She tried to scream for help, but managed only a hoarse croak. Moments later, she slumped forward in the sand, consciousness flickering like a candle in the wind. When she opened her eyes again, she saw moccasin-clad feet. She tried to focus to comprehend. People were speaking in low, measured tones, their words lost on her. She felt cool water trickle onto her lips, and she gulped greedily, ignoring the burn in her throat. Then darkness rushed back. The last thing she felt was a firm but gentle hand on her forehead, easing her deeper into oblivion. Charlotte's return to consciousness was like surfacing from the depths of a dark lake. She blinked, trying to recall where she was. A pungent smell of wood smoke and herbs filled her nostrils. Her lips no longer felt cracked, and her body, though still sore, seemed less aflame. Gradually, her vision cleared enough to discern that she lay on a mat inside a large wickiup, a domed shelter fashioned from branches and covered with hides. Sunlight streamed through the entrance, illuminating swirls of smoke. She turned her head to see a middle-aged Apache woman tending a small fire. With quick, efficient motions, the woman sprinkled dried leaves into a clay pot. Sensing Charlotte's movement, she glanced over. Their eyes locked, and the woman nodded, offering a quiet, kind acknowledgement before returning to her task. Charlotte tried to speak, but her voice came out a rasp. The woman understood her need, lifting a wooden bowl to Charlotte's lips. The liquid tasted bitter, but it soothed her dryness. Grateful tears stung Charlotte's eyes as she swallowed. Over the next few days, Charlotte drifted in and out of consciousness. Every time she awoke, the same woman whom she would come to know as Nantan was there administering a variety of herbal brews to treat sunstroke and dehydration. Sometimes other figures entered, Apache men and women, who spoke in hushed voices. They would examine Charlotte with curiosity, but never with hostility. The only one whose presence exuded undeniable authority was a tall man with strong cheekbones and gentle eyes. He wore leather leggings and a band around his forehead. Nantan addressed him with respect, calling him Chief Nietzsche. Once Charlotte recalled hearing the name Geronimo, in passing, a name she had only encountered in newspapers back east, usually described in ominous tones. She wondered if the fearsome Apache warrior was anywhere nearby, or if she was in the very heart of a band some folks considered outlaws. But these thoughts faded whenever the fever claimed her again, pulling her back into the comforting darkness of rest. On the morning she finally felt truly lucid, Nantan helped her sit up. Charlotte's first coherent words were, "Thank you for saving me." She pronounced them slowly, uncertain if Nantan understood English. To her relief, Nantan nodded. Though her own English was broken, she managed to convey that Charlotte had been found near death, alone with a collapsed mule. The Apaches had debated whether to bring her back to their hidden campsite. Some feared she might be a scout for the U.S. Army. But Chief Nietzsche had insisted they help her. Later that afternoon, a younger woman with a bright smile approached Charlotte. "My name is Isain," she said in halting English. "Chief Nietzsche wants to speak with you when you are stronger." Charlotte swallowed hard. She wasn't sure what that meant. Her mind spun with questions. Where was her wagon? What happened to her trunk? Did the Apaches intend to ransom her or turn her over to the army days turned into a week? And with rest and care, Charlotte's strength returned. She learned that Nietzsche's group had set up camp near a remote spring nestled between rocky bluffs. They were constantly moving, driven by tensions with the cavalry and by their own need to find resources. Some days the men departed for hunts. Other days they quietly dismantled parts of the camp to relocate. Through it all, Charlotte remained under Nantan's watchful eye, gradually picking up words in the Apache language. She repaid their kindness by mending clothes with her sewing kit, a skill her mother had taught her back in Pennsylvania. At last, Chief Nietzsche summoned Charlotte to a large fire circle at dusk. She walked slowly, the desert breeze rustling her skirts. The Apache gathered around, silent their faces, flickering orange and gold in the flames. Nietzsche waited until she sat on a woven mat across from him. Then, with Isain interpreting the chief, asked her story, why she was alone, lost in the desert. Charlotte recounted everything, the letters from Harold Beck, her arrival at Wilcox Station, the days of fruitless waiting, and her desperate trek to find him. When she finished, the chief studied her intently. His dark eyes held compassion, but also a hint of caution. Isain conveyed that Nietzsche had encountered false promises and betrayals from white settlers and the army. He warned Charlotte that the land was dangerous, not just because of the desert's brutality, but because of broken treaties and cruelty on both sides of the conflict between settlers and the Apache. A tense silence followed. Charlotte sensed that Nietzsche was weighing whether to keep her with the tribe or send her on her way. Would they leave her at the next outpost? Turn her over to cavalry patrols? As the fire crackled and sparks leapt into the sky, she wondered if this was the end of her journey, or the beginning of a fate she could never have imagined. The next morning, Nietzsche's band prepared to move camp again. They had word from a scout that soldiers were patrolling near Fort Bowie, searching for renegade Apaches. Charlotte suspected that was how the cavalry referred to anyone who resisted confinement to the San Carlos reservation. Though frightened, she also felt a strange pang of longing. If soldiers were nearby, perhaps she could ask them about Harold Beck. But would they believe her story, or would they dismiss her as just another lost traveler? Nietzsche assigned 2 women to help Charlotte pack her few belongings, what remained of them. Her trunk had been salvaged, though water damage had ruined many of her keepsakes. Her mother's Bible, thankfully, was still intact. Each time Charlotte touched it, she felt a pang of guilt for allowing it to be exposed to the elements. Still, she thanked Nantan and Esain for their efforts, deeply grateful they had bothered to rescue any of her possessions at all. The band traveled north, blending into the rugged terrain with an ease that amazed Charlotte. Men scouted ahead, women and children followed, and the dogs trotted alongside, sometimes nipping at the heels of pack mules. Charlotte rode a horse loaned to her by Nietzsche. He must have recognized she was too weak to walk long distances. During breaks, she listened attentively as Esain taught her Apache phrases, simple greetings, words for food, water, and gratitude. The tribe members looked on with curiosity, some smiling when she pronounced words correctly, others stifling laughter when she fumbled. One evening, as they camped in a secluded canyon, Charlotte mustered the courage to approach Nietzsche directly. She pointed to the sky and attempted to say, "Thank you," in Apache. The chief's expression shifted from guarded to soft approval. Through Esain, Nietzsche explained that gratitude was a core value in their tradition. Gratitude for the land, for the animals that fed them, and for the unity of the tribe. Charlotte felt a tightness in her chest. Here, in a place she'd been taught to fear, she had found unexpected kindness. Yet not everyone was welcoming. A stern-faced warrior named Ponche eyed her with suspicion. He questioned whether her presence would bring the soldiers down on them. At night, Charlotte heard him arguing with Nietzsche in heated tones. She understood only a handful of words, but the tension was palpable. It reminded her that she was an outsider, that at any moment these people might consider her a liability rather than a guest. In the weeks that followed, Charlotte learned to gather wild plants, fetch water from hidden springs, and even help with stretching animal hides after hunts. She practiced sewing buckskin garments, using stitches more suited to frontier life than to the Sunday dresses she once made in Pennsylvania. The older women of the tribe, including Nantan, found her willingness to learn endearing, though they occasionally smirked at her clumsy attempts. One day, while the men were out hunting, Charlotte wandered beyond the camp's perimeter to admire some desert flowers. Ponche emerged behind her, like a silent spectre startling her. He demanded she stay closer, warning of rattlesnakes and cougars. His tone was sharp, but Charlotte sensed something behind his anger-fear. She realized that if something happened to her, it could jeopardize the entire band. In response, she offered a cautious apology in Apache, bowing her head to show respect. Surprised by her effort, Ponche merely grunted and disappeared among the rocks. That evening, Nietzsche led the returning hunters in a victory chant around the fire, celebrating a successful deer hunt. Charlotte observed from the sidelines until Nantan pulled her into the circle. To her surprise, her feet found the rhythm. Though it was unlike any dance she'd done before, she felt a surge of belonging. The swirl of flames, the pounding of feet on earth, and the haunting chant filled her with an inexplicable sense of connection. For the first time since she left Pennsylvania, Charlotte felt she had a place, an identity beyond that of a mail-order bride or a lost traveler. The tribe had saved her life, and every day she spent among them taught her how little she truly knew about this land. She thought of Harold Beck and wondered if his ranch was a lie. She thought of the cavalry and the conflicts. But for now, she danced with the Apache, letting the echo of their voices rise toward the star-strewn sky, uncertain, yet profoundly aware that her destiny had shifted in ways she could never have imagined. News traveled slowly across the frontier, often passed by traders or scouts who ventured between military posts and distant settlements. One afternoon, while Charlotte helped Essaine grind corn, a small group of travelers approached the Apache camp under a white flag. They were not soldiers, but rather a mix of two Mexican vaqueros and a lone American named Samuel Wheeler, who claimed he was seeking peaceable trade opportunities. Nietzsche, ever cautious, met them outside the camp with Ponche and two other warriors. Charlotte watched from a distance, heart pounding. She wondered if these men might mention Harold Beck, or if they'd heard of any rancher who matched his description. After some tense negotiation, Nietzsche and his warriors allowed the visitors into a neutral clearing near the water source. A handful of blankets and trinkets were traded for goat meat and medicinal herbs. Throughout the exchange, the Apaches maintained a stoic reserve. Charlotte hovered on the outskirts, uncertain if she should reveal herself. Eventually, her curiosity got the better of her. She approached the American Samuel Wheeler, a wiry man with tanned skin and a dust-streaked hat. She asked him if he'd ever heard of Harold Beck near Fort Bowie. The man frowned thoughtfully. "I've been near Fort Bowie a fair bit. Don't recall a rancher by that name," he said. "You might check further west near Tucson or down by the San Pedro River. A lot of folks come and go. Sometimes they register false names to dodge taxes or old warrants." The possibility that Harold Beck was a pseudonym hit Charlotte like a blow. She thanked Wheeler anyway, swallowing the lump in her throat. Could it be that the man who'd written those letters never intended to claim her at all, as Wheeler and his companions departed? Charlotte returned to her tasks with a heavy heart, hoping her outward calm hid the turmoil inside. That evening, Nietzsche summoned Charlotte again. This time, Essaine wasn't present to translate, so they communicated in halting phrases and gestures. Nietzsche pointed to the west, miming a journey on horseback, then tapped his chest and gestured to Charlotte. She realized he was offering to help her search for whoever had abandoned her. His expression was sober, as though he understood the depth of her longing for answers. Charlotte tried to speak, managing only fragments of English. "Find Harold? Truth. Please," she said, tears threatening to spill. In response, Nietzsche handed her a worn leather pouch. It contained dried corn and a few precious turquoise beads. Through gestures, he indicated these would serve as trade or offerings should they encounter other tribes or suspicious settlers. Her gratitude overcame her, and she bowed her head, pressing her hands together in a gesture of thanks. She wanted to embrace him in gratitude, but held back, uncertain if that would breach cultural boundaries. Over the next few days, preparations began for a small search party, Nietzsche Ponche, and two younger warriors named Taza and Law. Charlotte would accompany them, though the rest of the tribe would stay hidden. The plan was to circle around Fort Bowie at a safe distance, eventually reaching a small settlement rumored to lie further west. If Harold Beck was real and living off some obscure trail, they might stumble upon evidence. If not, Charlotte would have to accept that her entire reason for crossing the continent had been based on a cruel deception. One last evening around the fire, Nantan gifted Charlotte a small hand-woven pouch filled with medicinal herbs, an acknowledgement that she would need all the strength she could muster. Essaine embraced her as they said farewell tears reflecting in the firelight. It felt like a sister leaving home. Despite the swirl of emotions, Charlotte sensed something else, a resolution forming inside her. The frightened, abandoned bride of a month ago was gone. In her place stood a woman who had survived the desert's fury and gained the respect of a people she once knew only through fearful rumors. As the group rode out at sunrise, the wind tugged at Charlotte's bonnet, and she took one last look at the campsite. Part of her wanted to stay to live among these quiet canyons and kind faces, but she knew she had to confront her past, even if it meant discovering a heartbreaking truth. Ahead lay miles of uncertain terrain, a land dotted with illusions and dangers, where even well-meaning travelers could vanish without a trace. But for Charlotte, each hoofbeat carried her forward with a new sense of purpose, guided by the confidence she had found among the Apache. They traveled under the cover of dawn and dusk, avoiding well-trodden roads and potential cavalry patrols. Nietzsche led the group through hidden valleys and narrow passes, relying on old paths the Apaches used long before the U.S. Army ever built outposts. Ponchi, though gruff, served as an able scout, often riding ahead to check for soldiers or suspicious travelers. At times, Charlotte wondered if he disliked her personally or was just wary of all outsiders. Either way, she had come to respect his skill. After several days, they neared a small settlement known as Cobra Gulch, a ragged cluster of buildings sprung up near a mining claim. Charlotte's heart thrummed with anxiety. The environment was decidedly hostile to Apaches. The men in these frontier towns often carried rifles quick to shoot at any Indian threat. Still, they needed information. So Nietzsche decided that Charlotte would go in alone, at first disguised in a borrowed dress that was less obviously of Apache make. Taza and Claw would wait at the outskirts, ready to come if she signaled. Ponchi and Nietzsche would remain hidden, trusting in Charlotte's ability to navigate the settlement. Steeling herself, Charlotte rode into Cobra Gulch on a dusty afternoon. The buildings looked weather-beaten, the main street dotted with saloons, a small general store, and a livery stable. She caught sideways glances from a few miners who raised their eyebrows at her unannounced arrival, but didn't stop her. She guided her horse to the livery and dismounted, the swirl of dust and the tang of manure filling her nostrils. Inside the general store, a stooped man behind the counter eyed her warily. "Ma'am," he said, tipping his hat. Charlotte mustered a polite smile. She asked if he had any record or knowledge of a rancher named Harold Beck in the region. The man scratched his whiskered chin, pulling out a dog-eared ledger. He flipped through pages, scanning names. After a moment, he shook his head. "No Beck listed here," he replied. "You might check with the sheriff. Folks pass through all the time, might have registered claims or mailboxes elsewhere." Following the storekeeper's advice, Charlotte made her way to a squat structure marked with a peeling sign reading Sheriff's Office. Inside, she found an older lawman. Sheriff Caldwell, who looked up from a battered desk as she entered. He asked her business, and she explained she was searching for a missing person who might have settled nearby. The sheriff considered her words, scanning her face. "I've heard many a story about folks vanishing," he said gravely. "Criminals, runaways, or sometimes men who never intended to keep their promises. Have you got any of his letters, or anything with a signature?" Charlotte produced the only letter she still carried, the one Harold had sent, instructing her when to arrive at Wilcox Station. She tried not to show her shaking hands. Sheriff Caldwell took it, examined the handwriting and frowned. "I don't recognize this writing. but I do know of a few scams floating around. A fella claiming to have land might write to several women, take whatever money they send for travel costs, and then vanish. Could be that's what happened. He offered her a resigned shrug. The words struck Charlotte like a blow to the stomach. Shame mixed with anger. Had she truly been so naive as to fall for a con? She'd never sent Harold any significant sum, but perhaps he'd run a wider scheme. Or maybe he was just a cruel opportunist who changed his mind. Unbidden tears gathered in her eyes. Sheriff Caldwell cleared his throat and handed the letter back. "I'm sorry, Ma'am." Feeling defeated, she left the office. Outside, a handful of drunk miners lurched down the street, boisterously shouting about their latest gold strike. She wondered if Harold had once been like them, drifting between false hopes and unscrupulous deeds. Her thoughts were interrupted when she noticed a man standing near a stable watching her, too intently. She felt a prickle of unease. Without hesitation, she strode to her horse, but the man stepped forward, blocking her path. "New in town, sweetheart," he drawled, a sneer twisting his lips. He wore a pistol on his hip and looked at her with predatory eyes. Charlotte's heart hammered. Summoning every ounce of resolve, she tried to move around him, but he grabbed her arm. "Don't be rude," he muttered. Panic flared. She reached for the small knife Nantan had given her, hidden under her apron. But before she could draw it, the man's hand flew away from her arm, and he stumbled back, yelping. Behind him stood Taza, his face grim, holding a stout wooden club. He had intervened, ignoring the risk of being identified as Apache. For a split second, the bully seemed ready to draw his gun. But seeing Taza's fierce stance and Claw stepping from the Shadow's rifle at the ready, he backed off, cursing under his breath. A hush fell over the onlookers. Charlotte didn't linger. She climbed onto her horse, Taza and Claw behind her, galloping out of town with adrenaline pumping. When they regrouped in a thicket of mesquite outside Cobre Gulch, Nietzsche and Ponche were waiting, eyes dark with concern. Charlotte explained what had happened with the sheriff, the letter, and the threatening townsman. Ponche scowled as if to say, "I told you so." But Nietzsche merely nodded. The possibility that Harold Beck was a fabrication weighed heavily on Charlotte. She didn't know which hurt more, the betrayal or the foolishness she felt for believing it all. Yet as she looked at the Apaches around her, she sensed a solidarity far deeper than any illusion. Their journey wasn't over, but something in Charlotte had shifted irrevocably. If Harold Beck truly didn't exist, she would have to forge a new path, one that might lie far from any white picket fence or mail-order marriage. Charlotte's disillusionment simmered in her chest like a slow-burning coal. She tried to put on a brave face as the small party skirted Cobra Gulch, traveling further west. They hoped to confirm the final possibility. Maybe Harold wasn't well known by the locals, but indeed owned some hidden ranch. Charlotte clung to the thinnest thread of hope, though logic told her the search was futile. They set up a makeshift camp near a crumbling adobe ruin, a remnant of some abandoned Spanish mission. With the horses secured and the night's fire crackling, Ponche stared at Charlotte across the flames. She had grown used to his intense gaze. Slowly, he reached into his satchel and pulled out something wrapped in deer hide, a small photograph of a young Apache woman and a child. Although worn and faded, Charlotte recognized the tenderness in Ponche's eyes. She realized he, too, had a life beyond this constant vigilance and suspicion. He shared no words, but the gesture felt like a bridge across the chasm of their differences. Their quiet reflection was interrupted by a distant noise, hoofbeats approaching. Instantly, Nietzsche and Ponche were on their feet, scanning the darkness. Charlotte doused the fire heart, racing. Taza and Claw positioned themselves behind a low wall, rifles at the ready. They waited listening as the hoofbeats grew louder. Soon, a rider emerged from the gloom, struggling to control a lathered horse. The figure wore tattered clothes and a broad hat pulled low. Before anyone could react, the rider tumbled off, collapsing onto the ground. Nietzsche signaled for caution. Charlotte squinted, inching forward until she saw the man's face in the moonlight. He was gasping, delirious from exhaustion or injury. She noticed a dark stain on his shirt, a bullet wound. Ponche knelt to check for weapons and found a revolver. He tossed it aside. Charlotte hesitated, then rushed forward to apply pressure to the wound as best she could, recalling some of the herbal treatments Nantan had shown her. The stranger's eyes fluttered open, and he croaked, "Apaches! God help me! I'm done for." But he lacked the strength to fight. His gaze slid over to Charlotte. He coughed wetly, flecks of blood staining his lips. Between ragged breaths he confessed that a gang of outlaws had robbed and shot him. "My name's Eddie Browning," he whispered. "Was on my way. To meet a cousin. Near Fort Bowie." He convulsed slightly, groaning as Charlotte tried to stop the bleeding. Nietzsche knelt beside him, wearing an inscrutable expression. Though the man's hostility was clear in his fearful glance, the Apache chief motioned for Charlotte to keep working. In broken English, Nietzsche asked Eddie who had attacked him. Rufus Blackwell and his men, Eddie managed. "They're terrorizing these parts. They took everything. Left me for dead." His voice trailed off. Over the next hour, Charlotte did all she could to stabilize Eddie. She used some bandages she had kept, plus the herbs from her pouch, to staunch bleeding and reduce infection. Ponche and Taza stood watch, uneasy. The man could be a liar, a trap setted for them. But as the night wore on, Eddie's condition worsened. He clung to Charlotte's hand, delirious, sometimes murmuring about a Harold Beck, though it was hard to decipher in his feverish state. At the mention of that name, Charlotte's heart jolted. She leaned closer, but Eddie slipped into unconsciousness. Could he have known Harold Beck? Was it random delirium or something meaningful? She looked to Nietzsche, who shrugged in uncertainty. Dawn was hours away, and the man's life hung by a thread. As they took turns keeping vigil, Charlotte realized this could be the twist of fate she had dreaded or hoped for. If Eddie survived, perhaps he held the key to understanding Harold's disappearance. Or maybe the name had just bubbled up from Eddie's delirium. Regardless, she had a choice risk traveling with an injured man in search of medical help, or leave him to die. She had experienced her own near-death moment in the desert and remembered the kindness of strangers. She couldn't in good conscience abandon him. Whispering a silent prayer, she sat next to Eddie, cooling his fevered brow with a damp cloth. Ponche kept watch, scanning the horizon for any sign of Blackwell's outlaws. Nietzsche paced, torn between caution and compassion. The night seemed endless, the darkness weighing heavily on them all. By the time the first pale streaks of dawn appeared, Charlotte's eyes ached with fatigue, but her resolve was unshaken. She would see this man through, if only because once someone had done the same for her. Morning light revealed Eddie's pale, clammy skin, and Charlotte feared he might not survive. She convinced Nietzsche that they needed proper medical help, maybe from a traveling doctor or a well-supplied settlement. Despite the risks, Nietzsche agreed. Taza and Claw rode ahead to scout the next town. Meanwhile, Charlotte, Ponche, and Nietzsche carefully lifted Eddie onto a makeshift litter behind one of their horses. They traveled slowly, every jolt sending Eddie into spasms of pain. Charlotte kept his wound dressed, administering the herbal remedies she had, but she knew he needed more. By midday, Taza rode back with news they'd found a small encampment of traveling merchants who included a man named Bernard Page, a self-taught medic. It wasn't a full doctor, but it was their best chance. He was willing to help for a price. Nearing the encampment, Charlotte braced for trouble. Indeed, the merchants looked on edge when they saw Apaches in their midst. A few men placed hands on rifles, but Bernard hauled. Page, a middle-aged man with spectacles and a weathered coat, stepped forward wearing a thin smile. After some tense negotiations, he agreed to tend to Eddie's wound in exchange for a few turquoise beads and some cured venison. Ponche hovered protectively, ready to intervene if this turned out to be a trap. Over the course of the day, Page used carbolic acid to clean Eddie's wound and stitched it closed with catgut. Charlotte helped as best she could. By evening, Eddie was stable enough to speak, though weak. With Ponche glaring, Eddie cleared his throat and gazed at Charlotte, recognizing her from the night before. "Thank you for saving me," he said haltingly. "Didn't expect help from Apaches." Charlotte chose to ignore the bias in his tone. Instead, she pressed him gently about the name he had murmured in his fever dreams. Harold Beck. Eddie's eyes flickered with confusion, then realization. Harold Beck. Yeah, I heard that name. Some fella was talking about running a scam in the mail-order bride racket. Met him in a saloon near Tucson. He bragged about how he'd swindled a poor girl out east into coming all this way. A real piece of work. Eddie swallowed, grimacing from the pain. I don't know where he's at now. Last I saw, he was headed for Colorado, maybe. Or maybe he was just lying again. Charlotte felt her world tilt. It was the confirmation she dreaded. Harold Beck had indeed been a con artist, toying with her life. She thought of the letters, the empty promises of a modest ranch. All of it a lie. Anger surged, but beneath it lay a sharper sting of betrayal. She had risked everything for a phantom. Tears pricked her eyes as she forced herself to remain calm. Nietzsche, watching the exchange, seemed to sense her distress. He asked Charlotte if they should continue the search or accept this truth and move on. Ponche stood by, arms folded, his expression suggesting that continuing would be a fool's errand. Charlotte took a shaky breath. I need to let it go," she whispered. "Harold Beck is gone. There's nothing more to find." For a moment, relief mixed with sorrow. She finally had closure, though it tasted bitter. Eddie tried to console her in a clumsy sort of way. "You're lucky, miss. Could have ended up dead if he'd been around. Or worse." Charlotte nodded, not trusting herself to speak. Soon the merchant caravan prepared to depart, uneasy about staying close to Apaches. Bernard Page insisted they leave as well, hinting that soldier patrols might not look kindly on the band. Charlotte realized she no longer had a reason to fear the truth. She belonged with the Apaches more than anywhere else. Harold Beck had abandoned her, but Chief Nietzsche and his people had saved her. She looked at Nietzsche, who returned her gaze with understanding. As the merchant wagons rolled away, Eddie sighed. "Guess I owe you folks my life," he said, addressing the Apaches with an awkward nod. "If there's ever anything I can do—" He trailed off, unsure how to repay such a debt. Ponche glanced at Charlotte, then back at Eddie, his expression unreadable. That evening, they set camp separately from the merchant group to avoid conflict. Charlotte slipped away to sit under a mesquite tree, alone with her thoughts. The sky burned orange and purple at sunset, a dramatic display over the cactus-strewn plains. She recalled the day she left Pennsylvania, brimming with hope. Now she felt a strange mixture of loss and liberation. Harold Beck might have taken her trust, but he hadn't claimed her soul. She sensed footsteps behind her. Turning, she saw Nietzsche. He said nothing, only inclined his head toward the horizon. In the falling darkness, he extended a rough piece of turquoise. She recognized it as one of the tribe's sacred stones. When she hesitated, he placed it gently in her palm and curled her fingers around it. Perhaps it was his way of saying she had a new home, a new destiny. With tears glistening, Charlotte pressed the turquoise to her heart, letting the final vestiges of betrayal slip into the desert twilight. In the days that followed, Charlotte traveled with Nietzsche, Ponche, Taza, and Claw as they guided Eddie Browning back toward safer territory. The injured man grew stronger under Charlotte's and Bernard Page's rudimentary care, though he winced with every bump in the trail. Despite his initial prejudice, he began to see the Apaches not as faceless enemies, but as individuals who had spared his life. Ponche remained watchful, but occasionally let slip a curt word of advice, like how to tie a better bandage or where to find water. Eventually they reached a fork in the road, where Eddie would go one way and the Apache another. There the two groups paused for an awkward farewell. Eddie, still pale and fragile, dismounted and offered his hand to Nietzsche, who hesitated before taking it. "Thank you," Eddie said, voice thick with emotion. "I owe you folks a lot." Nietzsche merely nodded. There were no grand speeches, just a sense of solemn understanding. Eddie turned to Charlotte. "I'm sorry about that man who tricked you," he offered. "I wish I had better news." She forced a faint smile. "Thank you for telling me the truth," she replied. With that, Eddie tipped his hat, mounted up, and rode away, disappearing over the next ridge. Ponche exhaled. "That one might actually live," he muttered in Apache, though Charlotte caught enough of the words to sense he was relieved. The group then turned south, heading toward the hidden canyons where Nietzsche's band was waiting. With each mile, the weight of Harold Beck's betrayal lifted from Charlotte's heart. In its place, she found an unexpected sense of possibility. When they finally returned to the tribe, Nantan and Essane greeted them with smiles and warm embraces. Charlotte found herself enveloped by the familiar smells of wood smoke and mesquite. Children scampered around her, giggling at her dusty skirts. She felt like she was returning home. She realized with sudden clarity that she no longer yearned for Wilcox Station or the elusive ranch she had once imagined. This was her life now, shaped by trials she could hardly have foreseen. The following week, the tribe faced a decision. Rumors spread that more soldiers were coming from Fort Bowie, determined to corral any roaming Apaches. Nietzsche, guided by instinct and experience, chose to move deeper into the mountains. Charlotte prepared to follow, without hesitation. She owed her survival to these people. She was in many ways reborn among them. On the final night before they broke camp, a small gathering was held to honor the band's unity. Drums pounded softly, voices lifted in a haunting melody. Charlotte stood at the edge of the circle, uncertain if she was welcome in their solemn ritual. But then Nantan took her hand and led her into the center. The circle parted, revealing Nietzsche himself, standing tall. Under the moonlight, he spoke words Charlotte didn't fully understand. Essane translated afterward. Nietzsche had acknowledged Charlotte's strength, her gratitude, and the bond she had formed with the tribe. He invited her to remain among them for as long as she wished. Tears of gratitude spilled from her eyes. She remembered the day she arrived in Arizona, clutching her trunk, naive and hopeful. She remembered the endless hours of waiting at Wilcox Station, the desert that nearly claimed her, and the con artist who never intended to meet her. Now she stood in a circle of people who had risked their own safety to save her life, and continued to stand beside her, no questions asked. Sometime after midnight, the music faded and the tribe retired to their wiki-ups. Charlotte lingered by the dying embers of the fire, gazing at the stars. She thought of her mother's Bible now tucked away in her trunk. She whispered a prayer not of desperation, but of gratitude, and perhaps a touch of wonder at how life can twist one's fate so unexpectedly. Before she left the fire, Ponce appeared, his face softened by the glow of the coals. In a rare moment of openness, he placed a small leather pouch at Charlotte's feet. Inside, she found an Apache-style necklace carved from bone and beads. Ponce said only a few words, which Esain later translated as, "You are our sister now." Overwhelmed, Charlotte clasped the necklace, feeling the weight of acceptance settle around her. At dawn, the tribe began their migration, wending through the rugged mountain passes. Charlotte rode near the front, guided by Nietzsche's sure direction, her heart as light as the pale pink sky overhead. Though the future remained uncertain, she no longer felt fear. She had discovered a resilience within herself and found a people who recognized it, treasured it. She had lost a husband-to-be, but gained a destiny as vast and wild as the desert itself. A destiny guided by the same sun that once threatened to take her life, and the same unwavering spirit that led an Apache chief to rescue a stranger from the dust. Thus ends the harrowing tale of Charlotte Gray, a mail-order bride who crossed the country for a phantom promise and found salvation and a new family among the Apache. In the span of mere months, she was transformed by the scorching desert sun, the betrayal that nearly destroyed her spirit, and the kindness that resurrected it. Where she expected only dust and despair, she discovered purpose and an unbreakable bond. Her story is a testament to the resilience of the human heart, no matter how dire the circumstances. If this epic journey moved you, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe to this channel. Your support helps us continue bringing stories of courage, redemption, and the power of unity to listeners everywhere. Join us again for more tales that prove hope can emerge from even the most unforgiving landscapes, and that destiny can change in a heartbeat.